Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily Mercanti, and on behalf of Carasoft Technology Corporation, I would like to thank you for joining our REI Systems webcast, Modernize Your Grants Management Approach. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. The audio portion of this webcast can be heard through your computer speakers, or if you prefer, you can use the dial-in display on the screen to listen through your telephone. All lines have been muted to reduce any background noise. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat pod on the left side of your screen, and we will do our best to answer all your questions at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we do not get to your questions, our team will follow up with you offline. To tell you a little bit about Carasoft, we are a trusted government IT solutions provider, delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, local, and education customers. Carasoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing to all of its vendors. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please do not hesitate to call or email us for any of your needs. This webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the presentation will be emailed to you. At this time, I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Jennifer Mentier. Jennifer has worked as a grant analyst for the Utah Office of Victims of Crime for 11 years. During her time at UOVC, Jennifer has assisted in administering federal pass-through grant funds from 2 federal programs. Next, we have Colette Litchard. Colette is a grant analyst with the Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. Her primary responsibility includes monitoring subrecipient compliance for all state and federal pass-through grants administered by CCJJ. And finally, we have Wagish Bartier. Wagish is a senior director with REI Systems. He leads all of REI's grants management project work at both the international, state, and local level, and has written extensively on the future of grants management in a number of industry publications. So to start things off, Wagish, the floor is all yours.
Wonderful. Thanks, Emily. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We have participants from across the country with us today. It's very exciting. Folks from Georgia, Oregon, Kentucky, Illinois, Ohio, Minnesota, Kansas, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, all over. So this is wonderful. The idea for this webinar actually came about during an informal conversation I was having with Colette about how beneficial it would be if government were to share some of the lessons learned and best practices with each other, so that instead of having to reinvent the wheel when it came to grants management, agencies could leverage what has been done, both good and also not so good, by others. So from an objective perspective, we have 3 objectives for today. The first is about the why. So to drive home an understanding of why grants management systems are valuable in today's marketplace and some of the factors that are driving that push. The second is the what actions are required from you all, and we're going to present a framework for putting in a grants management system that can be used to guide some of your decisions and actions. The third is the how. So how can the journey be taken? What are some of the things that can be learned and avoided going forward based on Utah's experience? So those are the 3 objectives for today's webinar. In terms of the agenda, it sort of aligns with the objectives. We're going to talk about the factors driving the market today, many of which you're probably familiar with, some of which you may not be. Then we'll have the folks from Utah talk about their journey, where they started, some of the things they went through over the last couple of years, and sort of where they are now from a system perspective. We'll then tell the story of some of the lessons learned and best practices along their journey. An important part is to start with the end in mind, so measuring success, what that means to them, and how you can use that framing will be the 4th part of the agenda, and then we'll leave some time for sure towards the end for Q&A to make sure there are, as questions pop up, we can, the folks from Utah can address those. So the two factors from a system market perspective, the first one here shouldn't be too surprising, right? So the increase in demand for systems is in part due to the size of the grants management market. These graphics here represent the last 4 years, including fiscal year 18, in terms of the federal grant volume of dollars. It is rising, and is rising very quickly. If you just look at these four data points, the annual rate of change is roughly 7%, which is much faster than the U.S.'s GDP growth as well as the federal budget. So that's an interesting piece. The other thing that may be lesser known to you all is in 1970, sort of about 50 years ago or so, the grants management market was roughly $10 billion, 10, right? So 10 to more than 800. And even in the year 2000, it was only about 200 billion, right? So it's been an explosion of grant funding in recent years, and seemingly that trend will continue. As a result, state and local governments often, as you guys know, have increased reliance on grant revenues as a critical part of the overall budget. For this reason, greater rigor, greater transparency, greater accountability has been top of mind for a lot of officials. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the regulatory and policy environment. So over time, looking back to 1970 to today, you'll notice that the extent of mandates and policies from the federal government has increased and has accelerated, right? Starting from the ARA back during the Obama years. In the last 10 years or so, there's been a number of new policies, regulations focused on grants management. So clearly there's a correlation with the increased federal dollar and the degree of oversight and compliance that's required with the management of grants. Interestingly enough, many of the recent policies sort of build on one another, right? The Executive Order 13576 established the Recovery and Accountability Transparency Board, which informed the Data Act, which in turn is now informing the GREAT Act, which is currently under consideration on Capitol Hill. So these are, again, bringing new requirements, new mandates to folks that receive federal funds. And in part, it's not just about compliance, but also about reporting and measuring impact of those increasing grant dollars. With this increase in oversight and an increase in dollars, the pressures on state and local government is growing multiple-fold. Interestingly, most of you play dual roles. You receive funding from the federal government, and then you also turn around and distribute those funds downstream into your communities to actually execute against various mission objectives. So the first side of the coin is as a grantee, which is the pursuit of and receipt of federal funds. There are a number of challenges we've seen among our customers when it comes to playing this particular role. In particular, the maximization of funding, given how big a part of the budget is a big deal. So being able to systematically track opportunities and what's available from a funding perspective is very important. But just tracking it is insufficient, right? Being able to collaborate between different program offices, between different bureaus, between different agencies is really important to avoid having two different groups within the same jurisdiction apply for a federal grant and reducing the overall receipts of funds. So we see that a lot, that because the left hand and the right hand aren't collaborating in the pursuit of federal dollars, it leads to lower overall revenues from the federal government. Another piece that is becoming increasingly common is the risk management of the federal grants themselves. With the rise in commonality of single audit and the growth of findings from single audit, many of the funds that folks bank on day in, day out to support their missions are potentially put at risk because of single audit findings, right? So not only are they losing out on potentially future funding, but also putting at risk funding that's already on the table. So that's from the grantee side of things. From a grantor side of things, whereas the management of pass-through funds or your own jurisdiction funds, there are a separate set of challenges here. In particular, the errors and inefficiencies that exist due to the lack of a system. Oftentimes we find many states, many cities, many counties are still managing their grants using Excel and paper. While people love Excel and love their paper, this is not the most efficient process to use, and oftentimes leads to errors, manual errors, human errors, rework, things like that. We found one of our city customers that they really struggled once the applications had been collected from the applicants to actually do that review and actually issue the grants in a timely manner. They were taking months to do that. After implementing a system, they were able to do that within weeks, right? So part of it is the ability to not have reliance on paper, where is this, and know where in the process a given application, a given grant is at all times, so that there are actions that need to be taken in a timely manner. A system will allow you to know that and for timeliness to come to play. The second piece is fraud and waste. Oftentimes, again, due to lack of collaboration or lack of time, it's hard to assess whether or not a given agency is funding a recipient that another agency is also, another program is also funding. So we found another customer, a state customer of ours, after a little bit of analysis that took them actually several months to do as part of their monitoring efforts, they found that they had a number of duplicative efforts going on between grant programs, between granting agencies, to the order of north of $100 million that was being double counted or triple counted because there was a lack of insight across how funds were being dispersed to the subrecipient community. So again, a number of challenges here, a number of things that are becoming exacerbated because of the increased dollar flow and increased regulatory environment. I just want to give you a quick snapshot of what we are seeing from our customers and what we're hearing from the market. But instead of just doing that, I thought it would be helpful to sort of just poll the audience, get your perspective as well in terms of what you're seeing, what you're struggling with right now, to set the context of the remainder of the presentation. So Emily, if you can tee up the polling questions, that'd be fantastic. So there are 3 questions here. The first one is about describing your involvement in grants management. So you can go ahead and fill that one out and let those results come in. Another 10 seconds. Okay, great. So the results will still keep coming in, but we have a good distribution of folks from, a few folks from the administration of an agency that are more interested in perhaps some of the high-level reporting and outcomes. We have a lot of folks from the grants management program folks, some fiscal folks. We have a handful of recipients, and we have a handful of other folks that are perhaps supporting the grants industry or find themselves in alternative categories. All right, excellent. Can we go to the second question, please? Second question is, why are you attending today's webinar? Perhaps the most important question. About 5 more seconds. All right, so this is another sort of split vote. We have a bunch of folks who have an antiquated system that no longer meets their need, in part perhaps due to the regulatory changes like we talked about. Federal compliance with mandates, similar. The need to standardize, that's actually the winning total right now. The need to standardize grant processes to drive efficiency. We talked about that. You look back at some of the challenges, and I'm sure the folks from Utah will also comment on this, the degree of inefficiency that exists when you manage grant programs very uniquely causes a lot of problems. Single audit findings, some of you admitted to them. That's wonderful. Better reporting and visibility into our grants, and maybe again a handful of other catch-all. And it may be worthwhile as part of the Q&A to discuss if there are other challenges you're seeing that haven't been addressed head-on as part of the webinar. Excellent. So the third question, what is your most time-intensive grants management activity? And again, these are just buckets of activity types, not exhaustive. Okay, about 10 more seconds. All right, so again, this is perhaps almost pretty evenly spread here. So application collection and review and federal reporting requirements are tied for first. Not surprising there. Both are very time-intensive activities. Both are things that, especially as the grant funds increase, the number of recipients is going to increase, the number of applications increases, and then the requirements reporting against those will increase. We then have the payment process. Recipients are always clamoring and they want to know where their money is, so the ability to do that quickly and efficiently is definitely difficult. And then we have audits and performance tracking. Excellent. So it's a spread. That's good. So I think as part of the Colette and Jennifer, when they talk about it, they'll address each of those in turn in terms of what they've seen, what their challenges were, and what they've seen. So Emily, if you can hop back into the slides, please. So in terms of what we've seen so far, right? So there's more dollars in the system. There's more compliance requirements, and there's more need to report on actual tangible mission-related results, right? So the path forward that we're seeing commonplace, and the reason why many of you are on this webinar, is how do I go about utilizing a grants management system to enable and accelerate what I need to do so I can free up my staff time to focus on the highest priority items. And to that end, I would say regardless of where you are in your grants management system journey, there are 8 components, capabilities that I would consider. I'll highlight a few in particular. The first is the idea of a single centralized repository for data, right? You want a portal for your applicants and recipients to be able to log into, to engage with you, and then for the historical data, both application, award, and post-award data be stored over time, one fiscal year to the next. You can create a data store that represents over the lifetime of a given grant what's happening. The other piece that's important is the full lifecycle management, right? You want the data to flow from the grant program initiation to the application process to the award process all the way through to the closeout of a grant. You want the system to reinforce and minimize the amount of manual data entry that happens. You're collecting data from both from a programmatic perspective, from a fiscal perspective, and from a recipient perspective all throughout. One of the benefits of having a system is avoiding having to type that information in multiple times. You type it in once and you can use multiple places. The business process and rules-driven workflow is all about alerts, notifications, reminders, and status, right? At any moment in time, I want to know where something is in terms of status, who's working on it, where's the to-do. That's very important from a system perspective. The shift from a federal mindset is in terms of actual performance management and the ability to define what are the key performance indicators or key mission indicators of a grant, and then track that downstream so you can report, hey, this grant program was meant to serve this particular constituency and generate these types of results. We can start to move down that path where we can assess, are we being responsible and accountable for public funds in a way that generates social return on investment. And lastly, there are a lot of the challenges we talked about involve better collaboration and sharing. Technology can be used to tear down organizational silos, and one of the key component of grants management is that there are lots of grant programs and lots of different organizations that are managing grants within a given jurisdiction. The ability to share and convey information easily will address many of the challenges we talked about earlier. So that's just to give you a snapshot of sort of things to consider. These are the things that we found over time matter to most folks that are both receiving grants and making grants. So we talked about the factors driving for the first part of the agenda. The next part, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Colette to have them tell the Utah story with a framing of where they started, what they went through, and then kind of where they currently are. So Jennifer, I'll pass it to you.
Okay, thanks, Wagish. Before I get started with my portion, I just wanted to tell Wagish and REI and Karasoft thank you for facilitating this, because Colette and I have found it really valuable to be able to collaborate with other states and agencies along the way. So hopefully you find this meaningful for you. So we're just going to kind of go through our roadmap as we have seen it with our office, which is the Utah Office for Victims of Crime, and the Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice, which is Colette's office. So Wagish was nice enough to sort of put together a roadmap for us of what we're going to be going through, where we identified our challenges, and then through our market research, soliciting our proposals, implementation, and then after we've gone live, and we are in the go live phase. So we have a lot of lessons learned and things to say there. So I'll just kind of leave you with this, and you can kind of follow along at the bottom of each of the slides of where we're at on this roadmap. So it looks like a lot of us from the polling, a lot of you have the same needs that we found within our office. We were one of those that Wagish mentioned that were managing everything with Excel and paper. And so most of our time was spent in those Excel sheets and paper and not spent in a lot of the other places where our work could be more meaningful. So our number one challenge that we identified was that we had a heavy workload with a very small staff. So just to give you a quick idea, we manage about 140 projects between 2 grant programs with a staff of about 3 to 5 people. And that management included everything from day-to-day technical support and processing of reimbursement requests to program plans, monitoring, federal reporting, everything that goes into a federal program. So it was a lot of workload with a lot of paper and a lot of Excel sheets for a few people. So we were looking to be able to streamline some of these processes and workflows and make things more efficient. A few of the specifics we were looking to make more efficient were we were looking to be able to better meet our post-award and monitoring requirements. With our daily workload of processing those payments and the technical support and guidance for subgrantees, meeting the in-depth site review and desk review requirements of our federal awards was proving to be a real struggle. And so we had a lengthy and time-consuming payment and reconciliation process. That was most of the bulk of our daily work, which was preventing us from doing that more in-depth monitoring. We had several spreadsheets that were involved in our payment process, several people, and so there was a lot of room for human error in there. And so it became lengthy and time-consuming to reconcile those because some of the time we were just simply chasing down formula errors in Excel sheets. And then our application process, I noticed that on the polling, a lot of you mentioned that your application process is one of the most time-consuming portions, and that was the case for us as well. We needed to be able to streamline that process, both in standardizing some of our forms and also just in the volume of application itself. And we have a little visual for you later on in our lessons learned in ROI, but our applications were about 50 pages each. We have 2 programs. And so when I did the math the other day, during a standard application review, our office was receiving about 27,000 pieces of paper that we had to go through. We were disseminating those to committees. It was 6 copies of each grant that we were disseminating to review committees, and it was just a time-consuming process even to organize those and get those out for review, and then for us to review them ourselves. And as I mentioned, the forms and systems were really prone to errors because we were in Excel sheets that had existed for a long time. There were, formula errors, there were typos, things like that we spend a lot of time tracking down. So efficiency was sort of the name of our game and putting our time where it was better spent. Another of our needs that we identified was that we needed better visibility and timely reporting, and we needed meaningful real-time insights into our grants. So because we were receiving so much on paper, it was hard to comb through all of that and make any, meaningful data out of it. That was anywhere from going out on our site reviews and having to comb through several applications at a time and financial data that was all on paper and kind of cross-referencing our programs, tracking and verifying program measures and outcomes. We would receive quarterly reports from our agencies with all of their program outcomes, but it was, we were having to sit there and go through all of those reports, and that proved to be really time consuming, and the real-time data. So that was something that we needed. And then we recently received a pretty significant funding increase, and so we needed to be able to identify funding and service gaps in our programs in order to target some of that increased funding and make our dollars more meaningful. So we wanted to have some real-time information and some data that was meaningful to us that we were receiving from the subgrantees on where we were providing adequate services, but also where we could, target some of this funding towards services that were needed in our state. And nothing, I think our third and probably most pressing need was that our old GMS was antiquated and failing. So there's nothing like necessity, right, to make you start getting in gear and get a new system. So this little graphic was sort of significant to us because actually our current system only works on Firefox. It's sort of crashing, and so we needed a new system. And our current system was mostly financial focused, so we needed something that was more all-encompassing of the grant to give us both programmatic data and financial data, and we needed something that that was working, was the bottom line. So now I'm going to let Colette talk to you about, after we had identified all of our program needs, how we sort of determined our system requirements and the process we went through from there.
Thanks, Jennifer. So to begin with, let me give you a little bit of history here as far as what drove our needs. So besides our department specifically having antiquated systems, there was a state entity that received undesirable audit findings, and in the poll you guys mentioned that there were some of them that was part of what you had, why you're here on the call today. So we had this agency that had audit findings for mismanagement of funds and unaccounted funds, and our legislature, of course, in order to address that, they wanted a system that would integrate with our state finance system so there was better accountability of funds to be able to address those audit findings. So they required a cradle-to-grave grant system. That means all the award notices, applications, reporting, audit findings, any data that's in there, financial, closeout, etc. They wanted that all in one system. We wanted, like Jennifer mentioned, to be able to get rid of our paper files and go electronic. And so because of all that, we took several years. When I say we, I mean the state, took several years to analyze what it was that we were going to need. We actually put out an RFI before we put out our RFP to get some information to see what was out there. And I want to point out that during this stage, the analysis and RFI process, that is one of the stages where it's critical to involve all your stakeholders. In our case, it was CCJJ, it was UOBC, it was our State Board of Education, Department of Health, and our finance people all were part of driving what were the determinations in our RFP. So this slide here shows actually the information that was on our RFP. It gives instructions for completing the RFP, and then this glossary of terms that's right here on the right-hand side, we have found that this has actually been critical at all stages, not just in the RFP stage, but in the implementation stage as well. So if there's any advice I can give you on this, it would be to make sure that your instructions for the RFP and your glossary of terms is as complete as you can get it to be. Like I said before, involve all your stakeholders to do that. And then as far as what drove our, wait, let me go on to the next one. So this is from our RFP also. We had 137 specific technical and functional requirements in our RFP. And again, advice would be as detailed and specific as you can. That's not only for your benefit, but that's also for your vendor's benefit. We had everything categorized as far as anything from general requirements to support and training requirements, accounting requirements, subaward, management, payment process, etc. And then as far as the deadlines and the critical milestones, those were really driven by the legislature when they mandated and appropriated funds for this. And then it was also driven by the department that had the audit findings. It was also driven by UOVC. They had two specific programs, their VAWA and VOCA programs, that they wanted to go live this year. So, you know, you're going to have to talk to all your stakeholders and decide what it is that's going to drive yours for that, but that's for some of them that drove ours, just so you know. I will turn it back over to Jennifer at this point so she can talk about the implementation stage.
Okay. So as we're going through sort of the implementation and lessons learned, this is one of the key parts that Colette and I really wanted to share, because, you know, as we've gone through all of this, there's definitely things you learn along the way and things that you would maybe do differently or, you know, see that you didn't see in the beginning. So our biggest one that we came up with was, what do you want your outcomes to be? When we were starting out for our office, we have processes that we've used for a really long time. And so it was kind of hard for us to see. We knew we wanted something more efficient, but in some ways it was hard for us to see sort of in the long term what we really wanted those processes to be and how those looked on a system. And so we decided that what we really wanted out of our system was more efficiency, obviously, because we had a lot of people spending time on things that were tedious and not really meaningful in the grand scheme of the work. But we also wanted reliable, meaningful data to come out of it. So as we sort of formulated how we were going to implement this onto the system, I looked at it in a way of looking through all of our forms and making sure that whatever we were putting on the system and whatever we were having REI customize for us was something that was going to be meaningful in the end, such as, you know, goals and objectives of our specific grant programs, making sure that the data that came out of those and those program outcomes were something we could easily reference and pull up in real time and make that data meaningful for our office. And sometimes that's hard, because accomplishing that means tweaking and changing some of your processes that you've had for years and years. And we get a little bit, you know, partial to our processes as much as they drive us crazy when we start to do change. Colette keeps telling me, she heard at a conference a while ago, you know, change is emotional. And that has been very true. We've realized as we've gone through this change that it can be very emotional. It can be very hard to see changing some of these processes. But in the end, they've better served us and better served what we're looking to do. Another one of the big ones was figure out what your grant business processes are, and what your workflows are today. We were in kind of a unique position when we went into this, where we were in a transition phase, partly because we'd had some staff turnover and also because we were receiving an increase in funding, and so we were looking at, you know, where we were going to go with that funding and how we were going to use that funding and implement it. So I think you need to really sit down before you ever go onto a system and know what your workflows are and know what they need to be and how those fit into an online system. Because we've found that as much as our current processes are antiquated and they drive us crazy, sometimes they're a lot easier to change and manipulate than they are once you've got a system that has a lot of you know, coding and back-end logic and things like that. So you really want to sit down and know that and be willing to be flexible, because sometimes, you know, you've had a lot of steps in an antiquated system that can be accomplished with one or two steps in a new system, but it takes some change and some mindset change on the part of the agency. Also, a big one was looking at what we could standardize across programs. Again, this is a thing where, you know, you have your grant programs, they're kind of your baby, and you know how you want to implement them. But as we looked at things with other agencies, and especially on a statewide level, and even with other states that we've talked to, we've realized where some of our processes can be improved, and standardization is really beneficial rather than keeping things so specific and customized to our grant programs. And then finally, one of the biggest ones was, what are all possible scenarios for your users? That's when we found an implementation where we've gone, you know, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of this scenario. I mean, you want to sit down and you really want to go through every payment process, every amendment process, every application process, and every possible scenario for, you know, variations in your applications that can be turned in and things like that before you start before you start implementing that. And then our biggest one is, oh, this is Colette. Go ahead.
So,
Oh, you're fine.
oh, that's okay. You can do it if you want to. But I was just going to say in here that one of the things that CCJJ and UOVC has learned as we've done this implementation process is to test before you go live. So I mentioned before that some of our deadlines were driven by UOVC's programs and when they needed to go live. And looking back on it, there have been times where we said that we wish that we would have tested the system before it went live. So just so you know that CCJJ has not gone live with ours yet, and that part of that has been because we've watched UOVC and the struggles they've had and with getting their stakeholders, when I mean their stakeholders, both their internal stakeholders and then their sub-stakeholders to get on board and learn this new system. And there's been a few struggles. And so CCJJ, that one thing that we have learned is we want to test the system before we take our people live. And then, of course, also there's going to be testing that needs to be done as you go live too, because we've realized that things that we thought were going to work great for us, that were driven by us, actually there was better processes, and so we've had to kind of backpedal and say, wait, let's rethink this. And so going on with that, make sure that you walk through all your processes from start to finish with an extremely critical eye. Seeing where, I think Jennifer mentioned this, seeing where you can change your processes to fit the system versus customizing the system to fit your processes. And then also walk through any possible scenarios. Things for us specifically were, could the system handle multiple payments at one time? We've had sub-grantees that may need a little bit more hand-holding that may not necessarily be as tech-savvy as others or have their systems and processes, you know, that are as detailed as what ours are. And so it's important to test for those lowest common denominators when you start your implementation and go live. And then another thing here is make sure you communicate early and often. And when I say that, I mean not only in, you know, from the RFP and analysis process, but also along the way. There have been times where, you know, Jennifer and I noticed something and we may not have communicated that to REI or even to each other or our internal people. So communicate early and often with all your stakeholders. Make sure you explain and clarify what your priorities are. We have also, like Jennifer mentioned, talked with other states and entities who have used or implemented this system. So that's another bit of advice. Make sure that you do that. Any chosen system that you are switching to would be helpful for you to talk to others who have already used that system. For example, we recently called Ohio, which I know Stacy Massey from Ohio is on this call. So, hi, Stacy. She has actually helped us by explaining what her processes are and the things that they have implemented, where we were able to extrapolate and look at our processes. Maybe we can use their model instead. Also, enable your users through the hands-on training and the ongoing support throughout implementation to go live stages. Also, use those frequent user walkthroughs. Everybody from the project manager and or designated trainers need to be familiar with the entire system, the ins and outs, the back end part of it. One of the things that we really love about this REI system that we're building is there is a function in there or a feature in there that is a help feature for our sub-grantees where they can click on a button and it'll literally walk them through that, and that's been really great for us. I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer at this point, and we're going to start talking about the lessons learned.
Okay. So we kind of touched on some of these earlier, so I'll just kind of go back through and give you a few specifics. But I think one of our biggest ones, as Colette and I have gone through here, that we've talked about over and over again, is customization. I think because we have working in Excel sheets and things like that gives you a lot of flexibility and ownership over your programs to just go in and change things. While it's incredibly inefficient, you also have the ability to change things frequently. But we've learned through this process that the less you customize, the less cost is involved, and the fewer bugs you'll have to work out. And honestly, there are some huge benefits that we've seen to standardization and to working within the system. I think if we had to go back and do over again, we probably would have said, let us test drive what you've got straight out of the box and see how it works for us. I mean, there's always a few things that need to go into it to make it work, but I think there are some places where we spent some time and money in the beginning customizing that we realized later on we probably didn't need to customize, and we probably still could have used, either what was out of the box or some of our old, just human effort to go through and look at. I think naively when we went into this, a little bit naively, we wanted a system that made the sub-grantees complete every field they needed to complete. Every form needed to be automated so that everything was just done by the computer. And there are some benefits to that, but there are also some downsides to that. So I think if you can work as much as possible within the framework, it works out better in the end, and you get a more standardized system, even at a state level, which we found to be beneficial. So, like Colette mentioned, be prepared for pushback from your agencies and your sub-grantees. I think probably one of the most time-consuming pieces of implementation has been working with our sub-grantees to get used to a new system. And I mean, we've been on our old system for, I think, about 10 years. And as much as they used to complain to us about that old system and want a more efficient system, as soon as we transferred over to a new one, they have some growing pains with that too. So be prepared for pushback. At the very basic level, Wagish was talking earlier about working on paper and Excel sheets, but for a lot of people, ditching the paper is a really scary thing. And so, I mean, they can still have the paper if they want it, but going to an automated system can be really scary for people, and there's some pushback even on that. Even in just, being able to print out the grant applications and have them in front of you and sit there and go through them with a pen and paper, which, I mean, you can, but this system also enables you to be able to do everything online and have access, right away to all of your information. And we mentioned earlier the flexibility and standardization. I think it bears repeating, there really are a lot of benefits to standardizing processes and standardizing forms and things like that. And so if you're open to all of that, I mean, that's some of the biggest lessons that we've learned is just be flexible, try to work within the system. And one that's not on here that I would say, listen to your developers. We have had conversations with our developers who have done this on their side for a long time and have expertise on that, and we have expertise on our side. And so there were times where we were really insistent that we change things. We went back and they kept asking, are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you want to do this? And they did it. And when we went back, we realized that we probably should have listened to them and worked within what they were telling us in the first place. But on that same token, there are places where you will need to customize to make it work best for your programs and processes. So just be aware of those things as well. And then I'm going to let again about, is this you? Talk about, Wagish, talk about your lessons learned as the vendor. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up on my notes.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, guys. So Jennifer and Colette said, hey, when you're presenting to other folks like us, it may make sense actually to share the vendor perspective as well. So that's great. Really helpful. I think there are a couple of things from a lessons learned perspective that from a supporting a state that make a lot of sense. One is, and I think it's been covered already, is the level of detail and specificity around your functional and technical requirements. I do want to give kudos to the state of Utah who are sort of on the journey to have an enterprise-wide system. They did spend a lot of time and effort sort of compiling a 150-plus set of requirements grouped by category, and they did a very detailed job. I think the one area, if I were to say, hey, if folks were to build off of that, and I think Jennifer talked about that as well, use scenarios to make those requirements real. I think requirement on paper, in the absence of having the chance to engage with the customer, sometimes is very high level. So providing scenarios, specifically what is needed, would be the next level of benefit to all vendors so they can reply in a way that aligns with what the actual need is. But I think the state of Utah did a fantastic job here. The second one is around business process reengineering. Is that part of the project effort, or is it not part of the effort, right? What can be used as is, or what needs to be changed based on the solution in the business process? So this is a little bit of a marriage between what exists in your business processes, your approvals, your workflows, and you're now entering into a relationship with a system, and then you have to see, where do you compromise? Where do I, keep this, and where do you keep that type dynamic? Going in with that clarity as to what needs to be kept as is, because there is business rationale to do so, and what can be modified to fit what the solution does natively is a very important conversation to have up front where possible. Again, sometimes that conversation, that dialogue, that keeping the marriage thing going, that therapy session only happens in the context of implementation, but if you can do that ahead of time before you get married, that's helpful. The third one is around the team itself. And I think, again, kudos to the Utah team. I think working together is very important. The implementation of a grants management system is a large and complex implementation. Having dedicated, committed staff from government involved early on in reviewing and validating requirements, doing walkthroughs, supporting some of the testing efforts, things like that is very important. You can't just sort of jump in right before to go live and expect the solution to work as you want. So when you put together the budget request for a system like this, there's going to be the vendor component, but there's also going to be your own internal staff that need to be supportive of this implementation from the start to the finish. The fourth idea is kind of the Pareto 80-20 principle, right? With any sort of more productized implementation of an IT system, the thought is, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. The idea is that you can have continual improvement over time. One of the benefits of modern software that we didn't really talk about is that the ability to continually improve it. So it's not like you're going to put it out there for the world and it sits and gets old. Modern software these days can be updated on a regular basis, daily if needed. So in order to go live, accrue some of the benefits of having a system, see some of those challenges addressed head on, sort of go with what is good enough from an 80-20 perspective and realize there are diminishing returns to customization over time. And lastly, I think has been touched upon by Jennifer and Colette, is the emotional component of moving from beloved Excel to a system, right? So the organizational change management and communication and training components to support user adoption is critical. One of the things that we found a lot of success with, and I think it was touched upon by Colette, is this on-screen walkthrough idea, especially for subrecipients. Some of these folks aren't the most technologically savvy, so the ability to have sort of step-by-step, click here, click there, to do actions in the system is very powerful and reduces a lot of the calls that come in and say, hey, I'm stuck trying to submit my application or submit my reimbursement request. So that's a key thing in terms of providing documentation, training, and then the on-screen walkthroughs. I think that all is very valuable, and as you march forward, definitely things to consider. So I'll hand it back over to Jennifer for the last segment.
Actually, it's Colette that's going to address this part of it, and then I'll pass it off to Jennifer at the end. So anytime you invest in a project, especially a big one like this, the hope is that the benefits far outweigh the costs in both monetary and intangible benefits. So before Jennifer and I point out our organizational and technical return on investments, both real and anticipated, I want to just take a second to acknowledge that my personal favorite part of this project has been developing the relationships, not only with my co-project manager Jennifer, but also with REI's Utah Focus team. Wagish, Manu, Pranay, and the entire development team have been just awesome to work with. So I'm done gushing now. We'll get into the meat and potatoes of it. So the organizational ROIs that we have realized so far and or hope to realize, first of all, like I had mentioned before, we wanted an enterprise system. We wanted one that would work with the entire state entities. You know, right now we have UOVC, we have CCJJ, we have USDE, we might possibly have our Department of Health, our Indigent Defense Commission, and then possible future ones that come in. So we really wanted one that would be all inclusive. There's unquantifiable added value to these cooperative type agreements because the input from all these departments and their processes really gave us a more detailed view of the entire grant management program within the whole state and the needs that we either have or have had. There's also been, or we hope to have greater productivity and programmatic performance because once we get over this hurdle of that learning curve of the new system, both, internally and then with our sub-grantees, we really foresee this being really less time consuming and, like Jennifer mentioned, getting rid of those 27,000 pieces of paper. It's also allowed us to more readily identify gaps both in our processes, in our funding that is going out to our sub-grantees, and then the services that not only we provide, but that our sub-grantees provide. Another thing that we didn't foresee going into this, as far as an anticipated ROI, is that our system, or changing to this modernized system, really meets the goals of the President's management agenda. And that's what this image is on the slide right here. That is the three-prong approach of the President's management agenda. This IT modernization, the data accountability and transparency, and then the people and workforce of the future. So like I mentioned that our legislator wanted greater accountability and transparency, and we're doing that through this modernization of our grants management system. And the workforce of the future, that just kind of follows along. So really, our goals and objectives really goes in with what the President's management agenda has. So one of the CAP goals, just so you know if you haven't read the President's management agenda, is results-oriented accountability for grants. That's one of the CAP goals. You can go look that up and read the details of it if you want to. But because of us changing to this system, it is making Utah a forerunner to be compliant with this goal. It's really where we were wanting to head to begin with in our business drivers and the needs that we had. And then one-stop shopping, this kind of circles back to what I talked about previously on the cradle-to-grave system, that all our applications, audit info, data in everything is all going to be in one system, and then all the departments and sub-grantees are going to use this one system. It's personally my favorite because I do a lot of monitoring on our grants. I really love the audit trails that this system has and affords us. So I will turn it over to Jennifer to explain.
So I mentioned earlier our 27,000 pieces of paper. This is our program manager for one of our grant programs, our biggest grant program. And during our normal application process, we would receive anywhere from probably 90 to 100 applications, and we required that they submit 6 copies of each application. And so this was the process we would go through to organize all of the applications. so that each of our reviewers in our office had one, and then all of those boxes you see back there behind her were where we would disseminate those to the committees and then send them via FedEx. I mean, if our reviewers weren't local, we have reviewers throughout the state of Utah. We would send them via FedEx to our reviewers. So it was actually very costly and extremely time consuming. And this is one where we've already seen a huge return on our investment in that this process now is literally a couple of clicks of a button to assign all of those to our reviewers, and they go out to the review committees the same day, that the committees can then start their reviews on our programs. And so this is one of those ones where you really have a visualization of how big some of that return on investment was, and we're saving trees in the process, so that's always good. And then a couple of the other technical returns we've seen. Colette mentioned the audit capabilities, and that has been a huge one for us. The audit trail in an online system, and especially this system for us, has been huge. Anybody who's in our workflows, the system is marking, who's touched what last, who has, processed payments, who's approved amendments. We can track when our subgrantees have modified goals and objectives, things like that. So there is an exceptional audit trail that makes the information readily available to us. We have the real-time financial information, real-time programmatic information, and that's been hugely time-saving, as opposed to going through those Excel sheets and all of that paper, or sitting with 10 files across our desk, cross-referencing things. There's more system validation, which means we're less prone to human error. If you'll remember, that was one of our goals that we had. For our financial system, each program is assigned a program code, and I'm sure that's similar with a lot of people. And those program codes are now entered by one person, one time in the system, and then it carries throughout the life of the grant. And so for, financial purposes and auditing purposes, that means that everything is staying where it's supposed to stay in the system. Everything is being coded correctly, and it makes reconciliation a lot less time consuming because it's just there. All we have to do is, run the report, and we can see real-time reconciliation of our financials, and we don't have to go hunting down, formula errors or program or typos or things like that. We can collect more data. This is something I wanted to mention earlier that I forgot. For our programs, we have them report on goals and objectives, and then we enter those into an Excel sheet every quarter. And so for our program that I mentioned a minute ago, where we have 90 programs, those people are all reporting on their goals and objectives. And so when we would make awards, that meant us inputting 900 different data points into an Excel sheet. And then each quarter we would collect that quantitative data from our subgrantees and enter that into the spreadsheet. And so that was incredibly time consuming. Now the system's collecting that data for us. It's allowing us to query that data and be able to pull all of that information that I mentioned earlier about, our gaps in services and where we're doing well and things like that. And so the data is collected, it's real time, and it's meaningful, which also, gives us more reporting capabilities. It helps us report to the legislature. It helps us show what we're doing with our dollars throughout the state, and helps us even, come to our subgrantees and say, this is where the dollars are going, and this is what we're doing with them. It helps us to make better informed decisions in more real time. And I mentioned already, the reconciliation process for our federal reports is much quicker and much more accurate. So that's some of the big ROI, and we are live. So that's things that we're realizing already within our system. And so that kind of wraps up our journey through this grant management process. We hope that you can use some or all of that experience that we've had in modernizing our grant management system in your decision-making and process, and hopefully it'll aid you in easing the transition within your own organization. So we appreciate you joining us, and we have a few minutes for questions if you want to go to some questions.
Yep. Thank you. I can kick us off for the questions. We had a couple come in, so we'll start off with, what trade-offs have you faced as you have deployed a grant system, and how did you make those trade-offs?
This is Colette. I'll take that question. One of the things that we did as a trade-off is when we talked about the standardization, and you might find this also, whenever you standardize processes, there is going to be trade-off. There was things that CCJJ were adamant, nope, we were going to stick with it this way, and we have actually had to reevaluate that. A specific one is the 10% budget rule. Our program managers allow that because that models the federal program budget as far as, being able to adjust within that 10% and not have to do an amendment. However, UOVC does not allow that, and in talking, like I said, with Ohio, they do not allow that either, if I remember correctly. And so CCJJ actually had to pull back on that and say, okay, we're going to standardize on that. So that's one of our specific ones. I think anybody will have different ones, but that's a specific one for us.
Okay, thank you. I have another one. How have both staff and
Jennifer, I can
participants
answer that
reacted
question.
to the system?
It's been mixed. We've had people that absolutely from the get-go love the system. We have a lot of subject matter expert reviewers in our competitive funding process that have loved the system and loved that they can just, jump on an iPad and go through and read the grants and score the grants and that everything's right there. And our staff overall has really liked the system because it's streamlined a lot of their processes. But I think also, and something to be aware of, is it has taken some time. I mean, there's definitely added hours with our staff in hand-holding through some of this new system too, and a lot of emails and calls about, just basically not knowing where to enter things or not knowing, why this system won't take this information. And I mean, and so there's definitely been mixed reaction, but I think overall people have really liked it. It's just those growing pains of learning a new system.
Okay, thank you. Another one here we have, do your VOCA sub-guarantees enter their
Our
PMT
VOCA
data
sub-grantees do not enter their PMT information through this system. They are still entering directly into the PMT system. That's something we've discussed with REI, and that's not a capability that I'm not sure if that capability exists yet, but it's not something that we've utilized. I did talk to our VOCA administrator yesterday about creating a